Making headlines for this week of November the 20th. France false flag. Evidence continues to reveal and expose the real perpetrators of terror in France and why. Secret collaboration. Obama and Putin photographed talking in private in Turkey, fueling speculation of unknown cooperation. Playing the West. Russian president gives IMF and the West an offer they have to refuse to expose their agenda. And the point of points. A three-part health series begins this week with a look at the energy consciousness model.
With news around, upon, within, and beyond our planet, the program making disclosure official. This is Cosmic Vision News. Here is Jeffrey West.
Greetings and blessings to all. It may seem that geopolitical events are rapidly moving forward in ways that are making it increasingly harder to deny that something very profound is now underway on multiple levels. With the events that have recently unfolded in Paris, I am choosing not to report on the events themselves, but there are numerous articles that have been coming out regarding what has happened with various other information offering their insights as to what it all means. The general consensus, as one may be inclined to guess, is that Paris was yet again a false flag event designed to create as much fear as possible. There are, arguably, a number of reasons to begin questioning this event immediately. I remind listeners that there are a lot of mixed signals coming out from all countries. One may argue that there are forces within all countries that are seeking to break down the control of this global cabal, and there are forces that are desperately trying to install fear into the general population to get them to support greater war efforts, which will preserve the power and control of this same group of people. It's safe to say that things are clear as mud, and trying to discern from the perspective of the general population is extremely challenging and arguably impossible. All that can really be done is to not go into fear and to remain detached from it all as much as possible, while trying to quietly inform others who are believing the marketed Western media message or who are falling into patterns of fear. It is worth remembering that it was about a year ago when Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu warned France, and thus the world, that France would be making a grave mistake if France were to recognize Palestine. One article reporting that fact came from Agence France-Presse via Business Insider almost exactly 1 year ago, on November 23rd. It is worth noting that the French government has been starting to pull away from the Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership, or TTIP, agreement. Cécile Barbière and Anne-Claude Martin, writing for Euractiv.com on November 17th, reported that Matthias Fek, France's Secretary of State for Foreign Trade, has made it clear that France will not support the inclusion of the Investor State Dispute Settlement Mechanism, or ISDS, in a potential TTIP agreement. The ISDS is a point of heated debate between the EU and the United States. Europe's fears over the TTIP are not abating, while America is beginning to show signs of impatience. Europe and the United States have reached a standoff in the TTIP negotiations over the question of this investor-state dispute settlement. For those who are unaware of the TTIP or its sister agreement, the Trans-Pacific Partnership, or TPP, these are trade agreements that are seeking to break down the controls of nation-states by giving greater powers to corporations and corporate interests over the resources of a country and the rights of its people. What is also worth considering in this scenario is that France is one of the few European countries who are known to have nuclear weapons. Also, France may not necessarily be strategically important geographically in the NATO crusade to challenge Russian borders. It is symbolically important in NATO maintaining its illusion of power and control. What remains to be seen and also understood is the impact that these recent events in France will have on the upcoming UN Climate Change Conference that is scheduled to start on November 30th. It would be wise not to underestimate the timing of the recent events to pushing a global agenda and seeking a united consensus while under a manufactured crisis. These events also set the stage for having a reason to have heightened police and military activity present during the event. As has been reported recently, a number of European countries are starting to question the purpose of sanctions against Russia because these countries have greater trade with Russia than they do with the United States. It is not in the best interests for these countries to be supporting a U.S.-directed policy while sacrificing their own national economies. This is perhaps one reason to suggest that a rift is beginning to form within the NATO-aligned countries, and this would provide one very good reason for the U.S. Israel-funded ISIS to launch a few events in NATO countries. The agenda being to get people so wrapped up into fear that they will push their governments to strike back, thus bringing countries back together in NATO. Let's look at a number of sources and what they are sharing this week. Arguably, perhaps one of the biggest pieces of reporting on the event came via RT. Now, as I was running late in the preparation of the newscast, I chose to use an earlier interview given by journalist Gerardo Coleman to RT as he discussed other terror events in France earlier this year. His comments are similar for the most recent events, and a link to the longer, more recent interview will be posted with the link to the interview you will now hear. These just may help sum up the whole charade and who is responsible.
Hi there, Garrett. MI5 officials had warned that jihadists were preparing to launch a series of attacks on Europe. Is there any way the citizens could have been better protected, or is this just something that you couldn't have stopped?
Well, there are many ways to protect citizens. One is to have responsible foreign policy. We have reports from the French press that the Kouachi brothers trained in Syria. We know from the French Prime Minister, for example, Manuel Valls, he has said that they had military training. That's a quote, military training. Now, so the first question we need to ask is this: what countries have been supplying military training to terrorists? And I'd like to quote here from Israeli intelligence-linked journal called Debka File, who published a report on the 14th of April 2011 during the NATO campaign in Libya. And here's what they say. Also discussed in Ankara and Brussels, our sources report, is a campaign to enlist thousands of Muslim volunteers in Middle East countries and the Muslim world to fight alongside the Syrian rebels. The Turkish army would house these volunteers, train them and secure their passage into Syria. Now the French people are paying the price for this lunatic foreign policy, this lunatic neoconservative foreign policy of the French government. And everybody is going to pay the price, because we are now seeing the institution of a police state. They are talking about putting police in supermarkets, inside shops. We're going to have police all over the street, military on the street, everybody's under suspicion. This is absolutely crazy. But I would reiterate, those who are responsible are the people who have been recruiting, funding and training terrorists. And we know from official sources that the countries involved in that, and we've been saying it for a long time, are France, Britain and the United States and their allies. And that needs to be known here. Second point, we also know from official sources that the CIA and NATO intelligence have conducted terrorist operations against civilians in Europe since the Second World War. Al-Qaeda and Islamic terrorism is an invention of Western intelligence. We know that for a fact. Secondly, Al-Qaeda's function and the function of Islamic terrorism is to be used as foreign mercenaries against states that refuse to submit to NATO hegemony. Secondly, they are used as a form of terror tool against Western populations in order to divide them. So what we see in Paris, for example, are teeming working class in the suburbs, composed mostly of immigrants, and many Algerians, many Africans and so on. And this Islamic terrorism is being used to divide divide communities. We've been saying this for a long time. If you look at the rebels in Syria and the rebels in Libya, these people were trained by Western intelligence. That's a fact. Now who's attacking Western civilians? The same rebels. We know we already know that these rebels were trained in Syria. Now they're saying Yemen. The story is changing all the time. This has nothing to do with religion. This is a complete farce to talk about. The French media are talking about Islam all the time. These people are not Muslims. This has absolutely nothing to do with Islam. This is to do with this Wahhabi death cult promoted by the allies of the West, Saudi Arabia and Qatar. Their best friends are promoting this satanic death cult, and that's what it's about. It has absolutely nothing to do with Islam.
Another outspoken commentator on global events and interpretations is Ken O'Keefe. In a recent interview with Press TV, he had this to say.
Yes, well, I hope actually that it's even more of a wake-up call for us to realize that we are ISIS, that the Western governments that are in bed with Saudi Arabia, who is the primary funder of ISIS, along with Qatar and other Gulf states, we not only provide the political cover and military assistance to Saudi Arabia while it slaughters innocent people in Yemen, but we also provide the cover for them to go ahead and do their dirty dealing with these psychopaths who are running around Syria and other parts of the world as well, Iraq. Let us remember that before the United States invaded Iraq, there was no Al-Qaeda in Iraq. Look at it today. Let us also remember that when Gaddafi was in power in Libya, there was very little Al-Qaeda. And in fact, now we look at it, and it's an absolute basket case full of these operatives. And we look to Syria as well as yet another example of where these problems were actually quite under control in terms of Al-Qaeda. In fact, Bashar al-Assad was assisting the United States, this is all on record, in a very meaningful way. In fact, many of the tortures that were being carried out were being done by Bashar al-Assad, or at least his regime, in order to extract information from people that we were supposedly fighting. I believe that it is beyond any doubt for any sensible person to realize that not only is the United States providing the financial cover, military cover, political cover for these terrorists through our proxies, but we've also, in pure technical sense, provided the training for these people in Jordan and Turkey. Another one of our best friends has been shuttling these psychopaths across the country from Turkey into Syria for a long time now. So, the idea that the West is actually fighting a war against ISIS is beyond ridiculous. So what we really need to do is start realizing the fact that we are ISIS, and the reason why our corrupt, treasonous governments are carrying out these policies is because they do not represent us, they represent the bankers, and the bankers make a hell of a lot of money off of war, and more importantly, as long as we're all fighting each other, as long as we're all not trusting each other, as long as we're all simply being played as pawns over and over, then they can maintain this tyrannical system of never-ending war. So this is really the wake-up call. What has happened in Paris is us. We are responsible through our corrupt governments for all of these policies, and even if these individuals who carried this out are not directly working for Mossad, CIA, ISIS, Al-Qaeda, all the same thing, even if they did this organically of their own volition, believe me, that is exactly what our so-called governments want. That is what the policy that we've been fostering over and over. And quite frankly, if we're to look at ISIS, ISIS stands for Israeli Secret Intelligence Service. They never attack Israel, and that in itself also tells you a lot about who these individuals are.
The whole history is starting to reveal itself, and the agenda is beginning to unravel against the global cabal and the politicians who were in the loop as to what was unfolding. With more on this, here is Ben Swan from Truth in Media.
And how can the world rid itself of the Islamic State? Now, before you listen to one more politician tell you what we need to do, you need to know what politicians knew about ISIS 3 years ago and the actions they took anyway. After the Paris attacks that left 129 dead, more than 350 people injured, and an entire nation in lockdown, there is no doubt that ISIS has to be stopped. Now, shortly after the Paris attack, ISIS fighters recorded this new video claiming they will soon strike the United States, including Washington, D.C. But look, there's no question that ISIS is a serious threat to people everywhere, especially to people in Iraq and in Syria who have been decimated by that terror group. In Syria alone, 9 million people have been displaced or fled the country, which makes what I'm about to share with you so infuriating. Well, 7 pages of a secret Pentagon document were leaked earlier this year, put online by the organization Judicial Watch. The report is from 2012, and specifically, it explains the dangers of what the U.S. government is doing in Syria at the time. Remember, in 2012, ISIS, as we know them today, did not exist. Page 3 of those leaked pages state 3 facts about the situation in Syria. A. Internally, events are taking a clear sectarian direction. B. The Salafists, the Muslim Brotherhood, and AQI, or Al-Qaeda in Iraq, are the major forces driving the insurgency in Syria. And C. The West. Gulf countries and Turkey, they support the opposition, while Russia, China, and Iran support the regime. So to be clear, our Department of Defense in 2012 stated that the Russians, Chinese, and Iran were supporting the Assad regime, and that the United States and Gulf partners like Qatar and Saudi Arabia were supporting the opposition to Bashar al-Assad. But the DoD also made it clear that the major forces driving that opposition were the Muslim Brotherhood, Al-Qaeda in Iraq, and something called the Salafists. Now stay with me, because if you don't know the term Salafist, that movement is an ultra-conservative Orthodox movement within Sunni Islam. The doctrine is summed up as taking a fundamentalist approach to Islam. Sound familiar? Salafist is the same belief system as Wahhabism, from which ISIS draws their radical, violent, merciless beliefs. So now let's go back to that document. Because after reading page 5 in section 8C, the Department of Defense warns this, quote, if the situation unravels, there is a possibility of establishing a declared or undeclared Salafist principality in eastern Syria. And this is exactly what the supporting powers to the opposition want in order to isolate the Syrian regime, which is considered a strategic depth of Shia expansion in Iraq and Iran. So what you need to know is that according to this leaked DoD report, opposition forces, the United States, the Saudis, Jordan, Qatar, and more, they wanted a Salafist or fundamental Islamic group to take over eastern Syria in order to isolate and overthrow the Syrian president Bashar al-Assad's regime. It was a plan to overthrow Assad, but 3 years later, Assad is still in power, and now the most violent, radical terror group in the modern world is entrenched in parts of Syria and Iraq, while exporting terror to Europe. So here's the real question. Why would we as the American public believe any politician who claims that they have a plan for what to do with ISIS when not one leader has ever acknowledged our role in the creation of that very problem?
Michel Chossudovsky, writing for globalresearch.ca on November 15th, noted 4 important things that happened before the events in Paris. He writes the following. Number 1, the French media had already predicted a terrorist attack more than a month before the actual occurrence. Number 2, the head of France's external intelligence was in Washington for consultations with CIA Chief John Brennan 2 weeks before the attacks. 3, on November 5th, 1 week before the event, the Council of Ministers announced its decision to send France's aircraft carrier group Charles de Gaulle to the Middle East, with a mandate to fight against the Islamic State. Number 4, on the morning of November 13th, an emergency scenario of a multi-site terrorist attack is conducted in Paris involving first responders, medical personnel, police, and firemen. An article appearing on the Kev Baker Show website reminds people that alleged drills were taking place on the same days as September the 11th in the U.S. and July 7th in London, and also during the Boston Marathon event. This article reported the following. Since 2001, the United States has led nations like Britain, France, Australia, and others into wars in Iraq, Afghanistan, Libya, and Syria, with drone attacks on people from the Philippines to Pakistan to all parts of Africa. We have little to nothing to show for all of that. Since 2001, the U.S. has expended enormous efforts to kill a handful of men, and this weekend, Jihadi John. Others, many without names, were killed outside of media attention, or were tortured to death, or are still rotting in the offshore penal colony of Guantanamo, or in the dark hell of the Salt Pit in Afghanistan. And it has not worked, and Paris this past weekend, and the next one somewhere else sometime soon, are the proof. We gave up many of our freedoms in America to defeat terrorists. It didn't work. We gave the lives of over 4,000 American men and women in Iraq and thousands more in Afghanistan to defeat these terrorists and refused to ask what they died for. We killed tens of thousands or more in those countries. It did not work. We went to war again in Iraq and now in Syria, before in Libya, and only created more failed states and ungoverned spaces that provide havens for terrorists and spilled terror like dropped paint across borders. We harass and discriminate against our own Muslim populations and then stand back, slack-jawed as they become radicalized, and all we do then is blame ISIS for tweeting. A November 14th article on countercurrentnews.com reported that only hours before the news broke of events in Paris, Facebook had allegedly stopped Anonymous from exposing ISIS recruiters. For those unfamiliar with Anonymous, it is a group of unknown people working together anonymously to expose plans that are being carried out by the global cabal. Another article on the same website the same day also reported both the French and German intelligence agencies as being aware of an impending event and yet did nothing. The agenda should be pretty clear. An article appearing on the cbc.ca website on November 15th asks the very relevant question, why do we mourn for Paris, but not Beirut or Baghdad, or for those who died on board a Russian plane that was destroyed over Egypt? The article writes the following. This week, the Islamic State militant group claimed responsibility for the bombings that killed 43 people in Beirut. The following day, a suicide blast and a roadside bomb killed 26 in Baghdad. ISIS took credit for those attacks too. Then, Paris happened. The mainstream media took over and began to tell the world who should be mourned and who should not be mourned for. One sign of the success of this campaign is to observe the people who have changed their Facebook photo to put a transparent image of the French flag over their photo in a show of solidarity to what happened in France. Yet, more people died in the plane crash in Egypt. Russia built a teardrop memorial and sent it to the United States in commemoration of the lives that were lost on September the 11th. Russia stood in solidarity with the United States, and yet the mainstream media did not cover it. Russian people are killed, and the U.S., with its Western partners and its media, barely acknowledge the event, except to report it in a way that supports the agenda that the U.S., Israel, and the West were wanting or trying to get from the incident. As always, the information offered is not to bring up energies of negativity. It is offered to allow people to reflect on what is really being marketed and sold by the Western media so that each individual can make his or her own choice about what is relevant at this time. There are many groups that offer meditation events to help anchor greater energies of peace. One such event will be coming up on November 21st, although this is probably too late for most listeners who will listen to the broadcast in the archives later. For those interested in yoga, a peace-focused event is planned in Mexico City on November 29th, and people are welcome to participate online also. Links will be in the show summary to these particular events for those seeking to join a group meditative or yoga event to support global peace. In other geopolitical news, there are two articles of interest to offer this week regarding the G20 summit that recently took place in Ankara, Turkey. The first article comes from RT on November the 16th. RT reported that President Vladimir Putin says he has shared Russian intelligence data on Islamic State financing with his G20 colleagues. The terrorists appear to be financed from 40 countries, including some G20 member states. In speaking to journalists, Putin was quoted as saying that, "I provided examples based on our data on the financing of different Islamic State units by private individuals. This money, as we have established, comes from 40 countries, and there are some of the G20 members among them. I've shown our colleagues photos taken from space and from aircraft which clearly demonstrate the scale of the illegal trade in oil and petroleum products. The motorcade of refueling vehicles stretched for dozens of kilometers so that from a height of 4,000 to 5,000 meters, they stretch beyond the horizon," Putin added, comparing the convoy to gas and oil pipeline systems. "It's not the right time to try and figure out which country is more and which is less effective in the battle with the Islamic State, as now a united international effort is needed against the terrorist group," Putin said. The article added that Putin reiterated Russia's readiness to support armed opposition in Syria in its efforts to fight Islamic State. Some armed opposition groups consider it possible to begin active operations against IS with Russia's support, and we are ready to provide such support from the air. If it happens, it could become a good basis for the subsequent work on a political settlement, he said. We really need support from the US, European nations, Saudi Arabia, Turkey, and Iran. Western media seems to be ignoring Russia's requests to work more with the US in truly eliminating the IS threat, and thus by making these requests public, it forces the US to expose its agenda, because the US cannot turn around and suddenly support a country that they have been demonizing and imposing sanctions upon. Putin has used this tactic financially also, which you will hear about shortly. In another article appearing on the geopolitics.co website on November 16th, this article seems to be suggesting what CVN has been suggesting for over 2 years, and that is the possibility that Obama and Putin are actually working together. The article writes the following. A video captures the two leaders having a serious talk in one corner during a recess in the ongoing G20 summit and BRICS meeting in Turkey. With the recent developments in Sinai, Paris, Syria, Yemen, and Libya, we can speculate that they are sharing critical information and will be coordinating their country's response to these events. What this means is that Obama's administration may have been working with the Russians all along through State Secretary John Kerry, resulting in his attempted assassination, meaning the bike injury that happened a few months ago. What gives Obama some gray hair is the uncooperative men and women in the White House. Notably, of course, is the group of Victoria Nuland, who are taking orders from the Bush camp. Victoria Nuland is the Assistant Secretary of State for European and Eurasian Affairs at the U.S. Department of State and was one of the prime orchestrators of the Maidan revolution in Ukraine that has resulted in the destruction of that country. This is just one proof that the U.S. presidency is not an all-too-powerful position in the U.S. A very powerful consortium is working behind the scenes, and Obama may be, for years, attempting to do a Kennedy with the help of capable leaders of other countries, meaning the BRICS alliance, to increase the possibility of success, and it is only now that he is doing it in broad daylight for even the puppet masters to see. To offer support to this argument, the article adds that Obama did veto the Defense Department budget for lack of provision to close Guantanamo prison and exerted all efforts to obtain a peaceful nuclear agreement with Iran. He also denied unfettered aid to the State of Israel. Further to Obama's credit is the recent report of the death of the Libyan ISIS leader. As mentioned earlier, there are different forces at work in most Western countries and others. A leader may have to do or say one thing in order to achieve an objective that cannot be reported publicly at a particular time, as it would expose what the leader may be trying to do. However, people and journalists will look at information and take it from the perspective of whatever fits the worldview the observer may have. This is why using one's own discernment is important with journalism reports from any source, including CVN. In Spain, it seems that at least one judge has the courage to begin taking on the global cabal, one brick at a time. An article appearing on the RT.com website on November 17th has reported that Spanish judge José de la Mata has drawn up arrest warrants for 6 former ministers of the Israeli government and also for Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. The warrants stem from an attack by Israeli Defense Forces against the Freedom Flotilla aid ship Mavi Marmara, which was attempting to bring supplies to Gaza in contravention of an Israeli-imposed blockade. According to the article, the investigation began after Spanish activists that were part of the flotilla filed a criminal complaint against the Israelis involved in the raid. In June this year, the 5-year investigation was put on hold, but can be reopened if any of the suspects visited Spain. The other Israelis who have been issued warrants are ex-Foreign Minister Avigdor Lieberman, ex-Defense Minister Ehud Barak, ex-Deputy Prime Ministers Moshe Ya'alon and Eli Yishai, former State Minister Benny Begin, and Israeli Navy Commander Eliezer Marom. The article also notes a UN report on the incident as saying that Israel's decision to board the vessels with such substantial force at a great distance from the blockade zone and with no final warning immediately prior to the boarding was excessive and unreasonable. South Africa also has arrest warrants issued for 4 Israeli commanders involved in the Freedom Flotilla attack. Although most would surely love to see things speeding up as far as arrests of bankers and political leaders that are abusing their powers, it is perhaps a positive sign that there are at least some souls in legal and judicial jurisdictions who are ready and courageous enough to take a stand and do what needs to be done to send a signal that abuses of politicians and bankers will no longer be tolerated. In financial news, an interesting little game appears to be playing out in the follow-up to the recent G20 leaders meeting held in Turkey last week. An RT.com article on November 17th has reported that IMF Managing Director Christine Lagarde had asked Russian President Vladimir Putin to postpone demands of a €3 billion debt payment until next year, implying that the IMF has confidence in the ability of Ukraine to meet that debt. Apparently, Ukraine has some euro bonds that will mature in December, and Moscow had previously been demanding repayment of its money from these bonds. By making the request, it may appear that the IMF is trying to get its hands on Eurobond payments first. An interesting move, however, appears to have been played, and it is the kind of move one might now expect from Vladimir Putin, a leader who has demonstrated an uncanny ability to think several moves ahead in dealing with the global cabal. The RT article writes that, according to Putin, not only has Russia agreed to restructure Ukraine's debt, but also proposed better terms than the IMF asked for. We were asked to postpone the €3 billion debt payment until next year. I said that we are prepared for a deeper restructuring. We are ready not to receive payment this year and instead be paid €1 billion in installments in 2016, 2017, and 2018. Putin added that Russia wants guarantees from the US, the EU, and international financial organizations, and hopes that this issue will be resolved by the beginning of December. To some, this may seem surprising, and to others it may not. Given how the West has treated Russia, and how the West has shortchanged Russia and imposed sanctions, one might think that Russia would demand the funds that are rightfully owed to the Federation. From this perspective, it may seem puzzling why Putin would not only put off the debt for a year at the request of the IMF, but also be willing to extend that to 3 years on the condition that the West will provide some guarantees. To fully understand this, it is worth looking at another article that appeared on the Russian Insider news page on November 18th. Alexander Mercury appears to have figured out the Russian strategy, that it was something specifically created to expose the West by offering them a deal that the West would have to refuse, thus exposing their agenda. Mercury notes the deal was made to the IMF and not to Ukraine, and that the so-called offer is conditional on the IMF or the US and EU guaranteeing to pay Russia the money if Ukraine defaults. Russia would accept €1 billion for each of the 3 years on these conditions. Mercury writes the following: if the offer were accepted, Russia would get all its money, either directly from Ukraine or from the IMF or US and EU, plus interest on top, only over 3 years instead of in December. Putin cheekily pointed out that if Lagarde is so sure Ukraine is about to become solvent, giving Russia a guarantee should present no problems. In reality, as Putin well knows, there is no chance the IMF or the US or the EU will ever give Russia such a guarantee. It is against IMF policy for the IMF to give loans to a country that has defaulted on other government debt, but the IMF appears to be willing to give further loans to Ukraine. Putin knows that the IMF cannot legally make such a guarantee, and he knows that for the US and EU, it is politically impossible for them to do so. All parties know that Ukraine will not be financially solvent in 1 year's time. The article adds the following. That rules out anyone giving any guarantees for Ukraine's debt. Putin's offer was intended to show that, whilst also showing Lagarde up. Lagarde asked Putin to postpone payment of the debt for a year, telling him something she doesn't really believe, which is that Ukraine in a year would be solvent and able to pay the debt. Putin fired back that in that case, Lagarde should have no trouble guaranteeing it. There do not appear to be reports of how Lagarde may have reacted to being called out by Putin, but Mercouri closes by writing that this is also another example of why the pompous and self-important, and in this case dishonest, grandees of the West, of whom Lagarde is one, find dealing with Putin so infuriating. In disclosure-related news for the week, at least one website is reporting on a mysterious vortex of light that recently appeared in Russia over the city of Omsk. The AlienUFOsightings.com website noted that on November 17th, the bright object was apparently seen by thousands, and the website offers several videos posted by witnesses. The article suggests that no response as having come from the Russian military or Ministry of Defense relating to launches of spacecraft or ballistic missiles. The video has a very similar appearance to a spiral that appeared in the skies of Norway back in December of 2009, and also other spirals that have been reported in other countries, including Canada and the US. Aerial anomalies have been reported around the world with what looks like objects that are coming out of what seems to be portals of some kind. This has not been verified as such, but it is the description that seems to reflect some of these anomalies. In a story that may fall under the category of soft disclosure, the reporting of stories that are helping to prepare humanity for the introduction of our galactic families without actually declaring it, an article from the Associated Press appearing on the cbc.ca website on October 29th reported scientists as saying that they have detected significant amounts of molecular oxygen coming out of a comet, an unexpected find that may have implications for the search for alien life and understanding how the solar system formed. Oxygen atoms are abundant throughout the universe, but because they react very easily with other elements, they are rarely found in molecular form known as O2. Scientists had previously assumed that almost all oxygen in a comet would come in the form of water, H2O, carbon monoxide, CO, or carbon dioxide, CO2. But using instruments aboard the European spacecraft Rosetta, researchers were able to prove the existence of large amounts of O2 in the gas cloud or coma around the comet named 67P Churyumov-Gerasimenko. The article continues, writing that Andrei Bieler, a research fellow at the University of Michigan who contributed to the study, said the constant level of molecular oxygen observed in the gas cloud indicates it was trapped before the comet formed and has remained there untouched since the early days of the solar system, some 4.6 billion years ago. Karin Altweg, who co-authored the study, reported that the process by which molecular oxygen got into the comet challenges some theories about how the solar system formed, theories that presume all matter was heated and then cooled. Such a process would have resulted in the loss of molecular oxygen. She added that the finding could also have implications for the hunt for life on other planets. Many scientists have assumed the presence of oxygen and methane is a good indication of life because those molecules are a byproduct of primitive life forms. Sarah Seeger, a professor of planetary science at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, who was not involved in the study, agrees. The article reports Seeger commenting on the findings as being a wake-up call, since oxygen is one of the key benchmarks used by scientists trying to determine life on other planets. Reading between the lines, the fact that a comet is able to have oxygen around itself may challenge the story of how Earth evolved. It is possible that a comet with a similar composition crashed into Earth millions of years ago, thus setting off a chain reaction that infused this planet with an atmosphere, thus preparing it to be hospitable to life as humans currently understand it. In another article appearing on the zonnews.com website on November the 2nd by Urza Magashi, he reports that well-respected top theoretical physicist Michio Kaku believes that the recent announcement about a potential alien superstructure being found next to a star about 1,500 light-years away could actually be the biggest story in the past 500 years. He also believes that this has to be proof of an advanced alien civilization. The article continues. Kaku went on to say that this star is breaking all the rules and that we would have to rewrite astronomy textbooks to think anything different. Basically, if a planet eclipses a mother star, goes in front of the mother star, starlight drops maybe 1% at maximum. However, starlight has been dropping at 22%, Kaku explained. There is a colossal, humongous object of some sort blocking the starlight from this star. We've ruled out all the usual suspects, rogue planets, comets, asteroids, and the only thing left is an alien superstructure of some type. We're talking about what's called a Type 2 civilization that could build a gigantic Dyson sphere, a sphere possibly bigger than Jupiter, to absorb starlight, to produce energy, and is right out of science fiction. We here on Earth are what's called a Type 0 civilization because we get our energy from oil and coal. Type 1 would be like Buck Rogers, and imagine we are talking Type 2. A Type 1 civilization, according to the article, is a distinction given to species who have been capable of harnessing all the energy that is obtainable from a nearby star and collecting and storing it to meet the energy demands of a growing population. This means we would need to increase our current energy production over 100,000 times to reach this status. A Type 2 civilization, then, can harness the power of their whole star, not just converting starlight into energy, but controlling the star. Numerous methods for this have been suggested, the most popular of which is the hypothetical Dyson sphere. This device, if you want to call it that, would include every single inch of the star, collecting most, if not all, of its energy output and transporting it to a planet for later use. Instead, if fusion power, the mechanism that powers stars, had been mastered by the race, a reactor on a truly enormous scale could be used to fulfill their requirements. Nearby gas giants can be utilized for their hydrogen and gradually drained of life by an orbiting reactor. The article goes on to offer definitions for types 3, 4, and 5 civilizations, and this brings up a few questions. As a Type 0 civilization, it is pretty clear that we do not know what we do not know. However, it also appears that there are some among us who are knowing what the next levels are, and are also giving them names and definitions. Where or from whom did they get this information if they are able to speak from the perspective of our current Type 0 civilization? The next question would be, who has been hiding or controlling this information? And a third question might be why they are hiding it, although for most listeners that would be the easiest of the questions to answer by far. What it does suggest, however, is that some form of controlled disclosure is taking place from the highest levels, and it is also coming from levels closer to the mainstream population, as noted in the next story. To the mainstream population, the following will not seem particularly relevant, but for long-time listeners and those who are accustomed to looking for signs of soft disclosure, the following may represent another example. As we approach another holiday season with messages of reaching out to others, an interesting commercial has come out with a message to reach out to others, but the commercial goes one step further, reaching out to the moon. The brief description appears on the omelto.com website and writes the following. A young girl looks at the moon through her family telescope one night and is amazed at what she finds. A man on the moon. In watching the commercial, the young girl attempts to find ways to reach out to this man who appears to be alone, living on the moon. He comes out of his home and walks up a small hill and sits on his bench looking back at Earth. At the end, the girl finds a way to connect with him and touch his heart and let him know that he is not alone. Like most, if not all, science fiction programs, there are elements of truth contained within for those who are ready and able to read between the lines. It might seem that this little commercial may well be another example of just such a message coming out in a positive way to reinforce the existence of life beyond Earth and to prepare the remaining parts of humanity that have been unable or unwilling to accept this reality up to now. The link to the commercial will appear in the show summary. Over to tech news now. We take a look at changes unfolding within the urban infrastructure in the coming future. An article appearing on the T3.com website on June 18th by Joe Minahane looks at the technology that is driving our cities. Minahane writes the following. Today's cities are developing at a never-before-seen rate. In 1990, just 3% of the global population lived in urban centers. By 2008, that number had reached 50%. Yet, tech in this time has started to transform our cities to an extent that they are beginning to run themselves. The article shares 5 technologies that are revolutionizing life in the city. The first is super cycle highways. Minahane writes that with environmental problems across the world, there's a greater emphasis on cycling and walking. Paris is already leading the charge. In April this year, it revealed plans to spend 150 million euro on cycling infrastructure in order to become the leading biking city in the world by 2020. Norman Foster's designs for futuristic sky cycle bikeways running above the capital's train lines caused a stir when they were revealed last year. Meanwhile, work is currently underway on a new north-to-south and east-to-west cycle superhighways segregated from traffic to provide a safer experience for cyclists. Number 2 on the list is smarter and more efficient cars. Minahane offers that the potential to change how we drive in cities and the impact on air quality, seeing as these cars are powered by electricity rather than fossil fuels, is huge. I think that once there are a few on the road, it will accelerate quickly, says Dr. Ian Pearson of Future Technology, marketing and strategy consultant at Futurizon. We'll see the beginnings of replacing public transit with self-driving cars. This, says Pearson, could be especially true in newly built towns and cities, many of which are likely to appear in the UK as the demand for housing continues to soar. The article hints that owning and driving a car in a future city will not be necessary. Parking garages won't be necessary, as automated cars simply move around and pick up the next passenger in need of transportation. It may also result in more parks for people to relax and enjoy life more. The third will be autonomous trains. Minahain writes that much like London, the Dubai Metro, Tokyo's Yirikamome, and parts of the metro networks in Paris and Barcelona are embracing completely driverless systems, with trains running automatically with no onboard staff. All the operations of these public transport systems are overseen by a vast array of remote technologies, from closed-caption television to automatic detection systems. There would be no turning up to work late and no more strikes. This may sound negative to some people, as though the automation will lead to less jobs. This may or may not be true. Jobs will transition, as some industries are eliminated and others are created. It will depend upon how people choose to respond to change and also who they elect to administer these changes so that they cannot be corrupted by commercial and political interests with an agenda. Number 4 is 3D house printing. Minahain writes that 3D printing is one of the most exciting areas in house building right now. In 2014, Chinese 3D printing construction firm Winsun revealed that it had printed 10 houses in just 24 hours. In January of this year, the company showed off a 5-story apartment block in the eastern city of Suzhou. It made the parts for the house in its factory before assembling them on site, giving a vision of how buildings could be constructed in future cities. Although 3D printing is still expensive, costs may be offset by the time saved in building the houses. The article estimates that construction time could be reduced by up to 70% in some cases, with an elimination of 60% of the waste. Minahain describes his number 5 choice as being the city of Seoul, South Korea. Minahain quotes Colin Marshall, a podcaster offering a program called Notebook on Cities and Culture, with the following. If you look at the West in general's idea of a future city, I'd say that Seoul captures it through the sheer speed of its development. In just 40 or 50 years after the Korean War, the city went from nothing to everything. This goes especially for its infrastructure. First, look at the amenities of the subway, its extensiveness, its frequency, its climate control, its mobile and internet connectivity, the robust economy operating in its stations, the fact that it has toilets. Then look at how quickly they've built it. South Korea, unlike the US and England, never lost its focus on creating a future city. In fact, one could argue that the country has almost concentrated too much of its money, energy, and population on rebuilding Seoul. If you consider constant change to be one of the necessary conditions of cityhood, then Seoul achieves it many times over with its very nature. There is much to look forward to, but the challenge will be for people to change their expectations of what the future will look like. In the past, growth was limited only to commercial terms for corporations and survival terms for employees. As the global changes unfold and as humans reclaim their lives and the planet from those who have been enslaving humanity and destroying the planet, our global societies will shift from a purely job/survival focus to a health-oriented living/pleasure focus. However, most people will have a hard time envisioning that reality coming to pass, so it will be up to those who believe in living this reality to step up and create it for the benefit of all. There is perhaps one technology that was not addressed in the previous story that has the potential to reshape urban living and working. An article by Leanna Garfield on November the 9th, appearing on the TechInsider.com website, reports on a company developing a transportation technology to dramatically reduce time spent on the road and global pollution. Garfield writes, Imagine if, instead of wasting hours in gridlock, you could fly above it for the same price as a bus or a subway ride. That's the idea behind Tram, a self-driving monorail that would hover 20 feet above roads and travel at up to 150 miles per hour. According to CEO Jerry Sanders, the system could turn a 2-hour car commute into a 10-minute trip. Everyone hates commuting, but there are no solutions, Sanders tells Tech Insider. The only way to get around traffic is to literally go above it. The article continues. Developed by Doug Malowicki, an engineer at NASA's Ames Research Center, the 300-pound pods would use magnets to hang from slender rails. It would use the same amount of electricity as 2 hairdryers, Sanders says. While current magnetic levitation transportation requires a continuous current, gravity, levitation, and short bursts of electricity would be enough to start the pod. After reaching a set speed, it would accelerate on its own through passive magnetic levitation. The cost benefits appear to be enormous. The article writes that NASA also claims that it would only cost about $13 million per mile to build, whereas a subway system can cost at least $160 million for the same distance. Under SkyTran's plan, each pod would serve a larger network that includes stations throughout the city. To request a pod, riders would go to the closest station. Once they enter their destination in the SkyTran app, it would assign them a pod. Unlike a typical tram or subway system, SkyTran wouldn't have a schedule. Passengers would just get in the first pod that shows up. The technology initially sounds very promising, and there is indeed much that is promising about it. When trying to observe the bigger picture, however, one may wish to consider what a city might look like with pods constantly going around an elevated track, especially at higher speeds. If one tries to imagine an elevated track all over the place, try picturing the current grid of electrical wires around any city, and this may give you an idea. It would also be wise to consider whether or not there would be an effect on people's health from having magnets nearby. Any dangers would not likely be as bad as the current dangers from transmission lines, cell phone networks, and Wi-Fi wireless signals. Certainly also is worth considering teleportation technology, which is allegedly already in existence, so one might wonder why this would not be implemented instead. SkyTran's 900-foot test station is expected to be up and running at the campus of Israel Aerospace Industries near Tel Aviv in Israel by the end of the year. Finally, in health news, there appears to be a somewhat consistent feeling or belief among many, at least those who are still grounded in the more three-dimensional perspective to global change, that prohibition of any kind will somehow make people or the world safer. There is a bit of an illusion tied to this because of the false sense of security that is marketed through the prohibition of something. In the United States, legislation seeks to prohibit people from having guns. Although I personally do not like the idea of guns, I do have to concede that given our current world, there are souls who are answering the call to carry weapons to protect others. There are also the people connected to the global cabal, such as police officers, who are issued weapons with a specific intent to harm and control a population through fear and intimidation. Prohibiting guns does not eliminate the problem of the global cabal that seeks to control people. Therefore, what prohibition does is force people to do things in a different way, and this may or may not necessarily be good. By prohibiting, the government is almost challenging the people to seek out guns just because they are now prohibited. It also allows police to act more harshly and to justify those actions merely by one having possession of a weapon. It is not the weapon that is dangerous, but the individual using it, and in most cases it is law enforcement, and those who are charged with protecting the corporate interests who are more dangerous with their weapons than those who are merely trying to protect themselves and their rights from being taken away by those same people. Some souls have chosen to answer this call, and none are to be judged for their soul contract choices. The same could be argued for certain drugs. Drug prohibition was merely a tool created for control and suppression of a population. Evidence is becoming stronger that the CIA in the U.S. is actively involved in the production, transportation, and distribution of narcotics around the world. Controlling the drug trade means controlling the population. By criminalizing drugs, the private prison system benefits by having more people incarcerated for offenses that may not have resulted in any kind of harm to anyone, but that one was unfortunate enough to become addicted to the drugs that the controllers were supplying. The same can be said for pharmaceuticals, although this is just legalized synthetic drug production and distribution. An article appearing on the TrueActivist.com website by John Vibes on November 13th reports on information being released by Dr. Carl Hart regarding methamphetamine in particular. Hart makes the comments that a common drug for attention deficit and hyperactivity disorder, or also ADHD, called Adderall, is basically crystal meth with a commercially legal name. According to the article, Dr. Carl Hart, an associate professor of psychology and psychiatry at Columbia University who specializes in drug abuse and drug addiction, is also an outspoken critic of the drug war and made comments in the media recently about how the popular big pharma drug Adderall is pretty much the same thing as crystal meth. Hart went on to discuss crystal meth and made a statement that would surprise many of the mainstream viewers who were tuned into the show, that it is basically the same thing as Adderall, something that is entirely legal and is prescribed to millions. When Hayes, the host of the program, replied back that this couldn't have been true, Hart mentioned a number of studies where the drugs were actually compared and found to be nearly identical. The article supports the comments made moments ago about prohibition, writing that in environments where drugs are legal, there is no incentive for people to create these dangerous synthetics because pure and safe drugs are available to them at low costs. The article closes with the following. In addition to not working, prohibition also makes life more dangerous for everyone because the drugs are dirtier and a violent black market develops which impacts the lives of everyone. Of course, this is not an article that supports drug use, but rather it is about understanding the bigger issue of control that is taking place in the world. The CIA produces drugs, distributes them, and then police arrest and incarcerate people to profit the commercial system of law and punishment. However, where crystal meth is criminalized, it can be given a legal commercial name like Adderall, and as long as corporations are profiting from it, then it is legal. Controlled addictions are okay, but when states and corporations cannot profit or control it, then it is not okay. In both cases, however, it is generally unhealthy and even dangerous, resulting from conditions created in a society where people feel a need to use these drugs as a means of coping with all the stuff the cabal has created for human control and enslavement. Creating a space for awareness and empowerment while guiding people away from choices to use drugs that can cause harm becomes part of the mission of all souls seeking to create a healthier global society and planet. However, dealing with this fire also requires dealing with the root source of this fire, and this takes courageous choices by many to stand up and speak out for change at the highest levels. The interview by Dr. Hart on MSNBC appears in the link for this story in the show summary. The previous story is a great lead-in to this next story. Understanding the dangers of big pharma drugs can empower one towards investigating other options and understanding the energetic nature of one's own body, and this can guide one towards finding solutions that are uniquely different and effective for each individual. This week, we start with part 1 of a 3-part series in understanding a more holistic health model. Jeremy Halpin, based in Stockholm, has been practicing Eastern medicine since his early 20s. He has been in practice for 27 years as a Zen Shiatsu therapist, acupuncturist, healer, and teacher. Apart from establishing diploma courses in alternative medical disciplines in 4 countries, he is also a published researcher in the emerging field of integrative medicine, the cooperation and synergy of Western and alternative medical models in clinical practice. Since 2000, he has worked as a keynote speaker at the Complementary and Alternative Medical Course at Karolinska Huddinge Teaching and Research Hospital in Stockholm, Sweden. The following are selected excerpts from the 15-minute audio blog in which Halpin describes the energy-conscious model, and this part is entitled The Point of Points.
One model that is both old and yet relatively new to many people is the energy consciousness model. It informs therapies like shiatsu, acupuncture, traditional Chinese and Ayurveda medicine, and more tangentially, some relatively recent variations like kinesiology, the Rosen method, and different forms of healing. They all make the link between energy flow, or stagnation, and its effect on the body-mind. While some use other related energy models, like the chakra system, most of them utilize the concept of points and meridians to work practically with it. Some therapies, like shiatsu, focus more on the meridian fields as a whole. We will look at this approach next week in part 2. Others, like acupressure and acupuncture, concentrate their attention on individual points and their synergy with other points. What are energy points? One technique acupuncture students have traditionally used to remember the flow and detail of over 360 points is through visualizing them as a journey of water from a deep well flowing out into small streams, becoming rushing rivers and eventually deep oceans as the energy submerges to connect with its relevant organ meridian system. The points lie in the spaces is a common saying in describing how to look for and locate points. If we were to imagine these waterway-like meridians almost drying up, the small dams, waterholes and puddles left would be the points along those meridians. In this sense, the points act like small reservoirs of energy. Note, too, that in the spaces between physical structures, like bones, tendons, and muscles, is the opposite of the anatomical model's focus on the structures themselves. One model focuses on the hardware of the physical body, the other on the software of energy flowing through it. As a child on holidays spent with my country cousins, I found out that many insects are naturally gifted at finding the space between structures. A cricket held in our small hands would soon find the spaces between our fingers and pry them apart to escape. It is just this skill for finding space in seemingly solid objects that is important for acupuncture, acupressure, and shiatsu students to develop. Scientific explorations of acupoints work best when they choose to look at the software aspects of energy itself instead of measuring biochemical or structural anomalies in these areas. The subtle measuring tools that would best serve this purpose are not yet in widespread use in the scientific community. Having said that, there has been research using traditional scientific method that have at least shown that there are measurable differences at acupoints. The spiral of energy. Whether we are looking at a thumbprint, the growth of hair on the top of our head, or a galaxy in space, we can observe how energy leaves its spiralic signature, because, as we have stated many times in these blogs, energy is also consciousness. We may also notice how our own personal development exhibits this circling back to go forward quality as well. The acupuncture pressure points exhibit this spiralic energy quality as well. Stimulating a point via touch or an acupuncture needle connects with this inward-outward spiral vortex of energy. Remember, it is the energy connection that is important, so very strong amounts of pressure or stimulation are not necessary when that connection has been made. Again, our focus is not on the physical structures we are in contact with. We are not trying to manipulate a muscle or a joint, for example, in the way that a massage therapist or a chiropractor may work with the body. By contacting with the natural spiral vortex of energy at a point, we connect with energy moving both inwards and outwards. Energy consciousness, therefore, is also activated. This would explain why so many clients report a new relationship of awareness with their body, get into contact with underlying emotions, and experience aha moments of personal insight during and after energy treatment sessions. Frequency bands. In my experience, each point spirals both inwards and outward, even beyond the physical body, and each curve of that spiral has a unique energy personality. We can access different bands by increasing or decreasing pressure, or, in acupuncture, by adjusting the needle. This technique, known as qi, loosely translated as getting the qi, is primarily aimed at obtaining the ideal two-way response at the point. If you have ever played with magnets at a polarity where they reject each other as you try to push them together, you will recognize this ideal equilibrium point where opposing forces meet and seem to resonate with each other. The client usually reports feeling the qi sensation a beat after the therapist feels it through their hands or the needle. This two-way communication is a key factor when working with energy and acupoints in particular. To press deeper, or using deeper needle insertion, after this point, breaks the two-way communication and reverts the effect back to a structural treatment. Examples of that is the strong physical pressure used in deep tissue therapy, and deep insertions of dry needle techniques used by some massage therapists and chiropractors to relax muscle tensions. Nothing wrong with that, of course, but it does break the two-way connection of qi energy consciousness with the client. We change from an energy dialogue and go back to a therapist monologue of us doing our technique while the client remains a passive receiver. By not being open to the bidirectional energy dialogue, we remain a doer. We may well do good or competent work, but we will miss the chance for the inherent intelligence of energy to guide our work. The state of non-doing opens up that possibility. Once we make that energy connection, we may find that the treatment begins to do itself. It may lead us in directions we would not have taken with our reasonable, rational intellect. It can lead us away from the distraction of symptoms and point formulas and into the root causes of imbalance and how to treat them. Once this energy merges and shows itself, we can dispense with the one- and two-dimensional states of points and lines altogether. Next week, we will shift our focus from points to the streaming fields of energy consciousness known as the meridian system.
The link to the article and also to the full audio blog will be in the show summary for this story. In this week's final words, I recently spent 3 days in Iceland, and although I didn't make it to the Blue Lagoon, which was one of my goals, I was at least able to spend a number of hours over 2 days relaxing in one of the thermal pools in Reykjavik, the capital city. I had some help from Elva and her son Ben, the hosts of the bed and breakfast where I stayed, to try to find some contacts within the media. I did not receive any replies to my requests to reach out to connect with media or with the Prime Minister of the country. I was brought back to the reminder of what it is I seem to be creating, and even though I am trying to open doors in other countries for living and working, there appears to be something that I am still not paying attention to for my highest good. Life has a funny way of bringing back to us things that perhaps we are not paying attention to. Case in point. A few weeks ago, I played an audio segment from Bashar, a message received via Daryl Anka about following one's greatest joy to the best of one's ability in each moment with no expectation that it appear in a certain way, shape, or form. I have shared with listeners recently that I am eager to move forward in redefining who I am and what my service is, with the intention that it will move me into higher alignment with who I am choosing to be, while also putting me in a location where I can have my own apartment somewhere and no longer be dependent upon others. Another audio clip from Bashar has crossed my path this week with a review of what was shared previously, but also with a little bit more information to elaborate on this formula for creating what one really wants to create. It would seem that somewhere along the way, in offering CVN to listeners, I still seem to be creating negative definitions that are preventing either me or CVN, and probably both, from moving forward. Hence, much of what I have been feeling over the last year is a creation of my own, and I am the first person to own this, and I blame no one else for what I seemingly have created both consciously and unconsciously. In my current role with CVN, I am moving along this transformational journey with each one of you, and I am moving through my own issues for personal growth, release, and healing. I want to emphasize that my service does not make me any more important, nor does it make me any less important than each of you. Each one of you has a vital, special, and equally valuable message to share, and it will be uniquely suited to the one you are, and also to the one you are choosing to be. Please note there is a difference between who you are, a spiritual being having a human experience, and who you are choosing to be, a human living this experience through multiple filters of fear and separation based on one's life path experiences and reactions to them. I guess this was a reminder that I needed to have, and thus perhaps it may also be a reminder that some listeners may need to have. Regardless, even those who did not hear the message aired weeks ago, perhaps they might find benefit from the words shared here. I remind listeners that even if you may not agree with the source of the information, pay closer attention to the words and the message itself. It matters not who or what the source of the information is. What matters more is whether or not the message and the energies feel right to you, in your heart, in the current moment of now. As I reflect more, I'm going to have to find a way to redefine my experience and connect to that in a meaningful way, so as to reshape the experience I am currently having into an experience that I am desiring more to experience, ultimately for my highest good and the highest good of all, including our planet. May we all begin to connect more and more to the choices that give each of us the excitement to move forward in our service, and may we each receive the empowerment and courage to take that excitement as far as we can possibly take it in co-creating the better world we are all claiming to want to experience. Create a wonderful week. Until our next moment of now, the following audio comes from a YouTube presentation featuring Bashar in a message received via Daryl Anka from a presentation entitled The 11 Elements of Excitement.
I want to do amazing things in this life.
Then do them. Nothing is stopping you.
That's my question. What I want...
What you want?
What I want to, the platform that I want to be able to use my creativity and my life purpose.
What you prefer to do, how you prefer to express yourself?
Yes, and I would like to be sustained financially.
Why wouldn't you be?
That's my question.
Do you understand what we mean when we talk about the idea of the formula and the complete kit of excitement and how it works? Or do you need a refresher?
Oh, okay.
So that means no, you don't understand it.
I would like clarity on...
All right, here are the 11 elements. Are you ready?
Okay.
The first part contains 3 elements. Number 1, you act on anything that contains more excitement than anything else, any other option. Number 2, to the best of your ability, taking it as far as you can until you can take it no further. Number 3, with absolutely zero insistence or assumption on what the outcome ought to be. 1, 2, 3. That's the first part of the formula. The next part is the toolkit. And when you use that 3-part formula of acting on your highest excitement to the best of your ability with no insistence on a particular outcome, you activate the kit, which contains everything you need to be supported in your life, no matter in what form it may come. It becomes the driving engine of your life that moves you forward through life. It becomes the organizing principle in your life that demonstrates through synchronicity exactly what you need to do, when you need to do it, with whom you need to do it, where you need to do it. It becomes the path of least resistance in your life that allows you to flow through your life in the easiest possible way. It becomes the path that connects to all other expressions of your excitement that are in alignment with your true vibration. Even though they may all look very different, it's the excitement that tells you they're connected, not how they look on the surface. And the final tool, it is the reflective mirror that reveals to you anything within your unconscious mind that might be out of alignment with your excitement, so that you can make it conscious, redefine it, and add its energy to the momentum of your excitement. Once that kit is working for you in that way, the only thing left to do is that when any circumstance or situation arises based on the actions you've taken with your excitement, whatever they may be, you then have the choice in the face of that circumstance to define it positively and get a beneficial effect, or define it negatively and get a negative effect. That's it. So when you say, I want to do this, I want to be financially supported, if you understand the mechanism, how it works, how this formula works, what you really are saying is, I prefer to act on my highest excitement to the best of my ability with no insistence on a particular outcome, because if I do, I know beyond a shadow of a doubt I will be supported in whatever form of abundance is actually most synchronous, most representative of the path of least resistance. No matter how it looks, it is the correct form, and I will not insist on my abundance appearing only in one form, because I know that if I do, I'm actually closing the door through which other forms of abundance might come. And therefore, whatever circumstance or situation crops up when I take these actions, knowing that the kit is serving and supporting me in the way that it needs to, may not always be the way my ego wants it to, but I know it's the way that I need it to be most representative of who I am, then I will always choose to define the circumstance that arises therefrom in the most positive way possible, because that's what I prefer. And it doesn't matter how the situation may have been generated, and it doesn't matter what anyone else thinks about it. It doesn't matter what anyone else's opinion is in that circumstance. I choose that every circumstance that crops up from my actions serves me in a positive way, and then I know that even if I can't always fathom exactly how that's going to look, it's always going to work out to my benefit, period. That's the equation. That's how it works. It works flawlessly for everyone, including you. It's always working. It's just that many of you may be filling it with definitions that are out of alignment with who you truly are, and therefore it seems to not be working. But in fact, it's actually working by churning out circumstances and situations that are completely representative of the definitions that you feed it. So negative definition in, negative experience out. It seems to not be working, but it is. It's supporting your negative definition. So, if the mechanism is capable of supporting your negative definitions, it is certainly capable of supporting the positive ones. It's up to you to decide how you want to use the machine, how you want to use the tools. You can pick up a hammer and you can say, I'm going to drive this nail into the board. But if you're using the wooden end of the hammer, it's going to be quite a bit more challenging. When you understand how to use the tool, you'll turn the hammer around, hit the nail on the head, and in one stroke, it's in the board. So, if it's taking more than one or a few strokes That's your first clue you're using the wrong end of the hammer. Turn it around. Understand the mechanism. Have a clearer definition of the mechanism, and you will see that it is working for you, but it's working for you in a way you don't prefer because that's what you're feeding it.
So that is a sample of the unfolding higher consciousness news around the world this week. Cosmic Vision News is broadcast weekly from the CosmicVisionNews.com website. Links to stories used in this broadcast are published in the show summary on the website. CVN can be followed through its Facebook page, Scene page, and YouTube channel, as well as Twitter, Google+, and LinkedIn. Thank you for sharing your time with me. I'm Jeffrey West, reminding you that patience is being at peace with the process of life. Until our next moment of now, stay grounded in love, hold the vision of light and peace in your hearts, and keep your eyes to the skies. Disclosure is unfolding all around you. Namaste.